My name is Tim Ross. I'm a resident of Jefferson County for the past 20 years, Jefferson County, West Virginia. I'm a retired meteorologist from the National Weather
One of the
Service.
reasons some people aren't so concerned about Rockwool setting up in Jefferson County is that they look at Byhalia, Mississippi, and they look at Milton, Ontario, and they don't see a crisis there.
Well, I think Jefferson County is unique. It's like one of those pictures where they say, here's three things, one of them is different, okay? And we are very different. I've never heard Mississippi referred to as the mountain state, which we are, all right? Northern Mississippi is more flat, and the Ontario plant is flat land, a heavy industrial area near the lakes, okay? While we are a mountain valley. We are surrounded by mountains, which has a tremendous effect on the dispersion of pollutants, okay? And that's the main thing. You have something that's polluting, but then where is that pollution going, all right? And we are different from those two in that we just have, due to the geography and topography and other things, there are times it's not going to go anywhere. Okay, the things that affect dispersion in our county, first of all, to have dispersion in the atmosphere, you need air moving to take it elsewhere, okay? Because when they look for violations, they're time averaging. They're averaging over days or months or how many occurrences in a year, all right? About a third of the time, due to, again, to geography and climatology, we're set up to where things don't really move here. We are subject to what is known as inversions. And every place is occasionally going to have them, all right? But we are prone to about a third of the time to have what's known as an inversion in the atmosphere, which traps things in the local atmosphere. And because we are in a mountain valley, it takes even longer to break that inversion and to move whatever's in here out. One of the hardest problems here, you'll see the meteorologists in their forecast discussions, is, well, the models aren't doing too good on how long it's going to take to scour out the valley, okay? And even with our robust weather models that we have now, they still have issues at times figuring out when is the valley going to be scoured out. And while it's not scoured out, things aren't going anywhere. They are simply trapped here. They could have done a year of on-site monitoring and then used that data to show here, this is what the background is, right? And this is what whatever we do is going to affect it. But in the interest of time, in their interest of time, to get this done as soon as possible, they proposed using data from other stations to say, oh, this is what is truly going on in Jefferson County, and then use their models and say, this is how to add to it. Well, between the idea and the reality falls the shadow, all right? And the shadow in this case is that the sites they chose for their data sites weren't really based on good science. It went against guidance from the EPA and common sense meteorology science. And in the end, we're not even sure what data was actually used. There was data that Rockwool said that they were going to use, but then the DEP came out with the permit and said, this is the data that Rockwool used. And those data sites are not the same. The DEP came out and said, based upon all the available data, our people found that the Rockwool would not cause any issues. Well, the problem was, there's a discrepancy from the data proposed and the data used, and that data was not available as much as the DEP led to. They said available data, but two of the main sites that they were using, there was a lot of data missing. So it's kind of obfuscation. Well, we used all the available data, but guess what? There was a lot missing, okay? And they started off using the upper air station at Dulles Airport, Virginia, which in their report, they located in Maryland, okay? The DEP report, when they gave them the permit, repeated that mistake. They too said the Dulles Airport is located in Maryland. So when you see something like that right off the bat, you really have to look closer at everything comes after, okay? If you can't locate one of the major airports of the United States correctly, right? That's worrisome, all right? But they wanted to say, well, they picked a site in Garrett County, Maryland, which is I think about 75 miles to the northwest of us, at about 1,900 feet, which is about 1,500 feet higher, okay? And they completed for several locations around our area what's known as a windrose, which is just a graphical example of the majority of the time where the winds blow from and the speed, okay? At the surface, right? Well, even the EPA says, well, you shouldn't really use a windrose at the surface to determine about transport up above it, because winds change as you go up in elevation, all right? Generally, if the wind is westerly on the surface, then there'll be more northwesterly above. But you have lots of different changes. But Rockwool, in all their instances, of all the sites that they proposed, they use these surface wind charts, okay? So in this case, the surface is like 1,500 feet above us. They shouldn't have used that. So they proposed Garrett Park, Maryland, which is to the northwest of us. They proposed a location in Adams County, Pennsylvania, which is like 60, 70 miles to the northeast of us, and the Martinsburg Airport, which is 10 miles, let's say, northwest of the site, and that's also where they were having a particulate monitor, okay? So first of all, I objected to those because, well, you're basing them on a windrose, and you've totally ignored any transport that might occur from the southwest or the south or even the southeast, okay? So they just assumed that where the wind generally blows from is where the wind blows from all the time, okay? So that was a major problem for me, all right? But then if you're going to have data, you should have good data, and you should have a lot of it, all right? 16% of the data was missing from the point in Garrett Park. To me, that's a pretty large number if you're trying to duplicate the actuality, all right? The Berkeley County site for PM 2.5, 9% of the data was missing. Now you might think, oh, 9%, that's not bad, right? But the thing is, that sensor only takes a reading once a day, every third day. So if you're missing 9%, then we sat down with a calendar and figured it out, you're missing anywhere from 33 to 53 days worth of data over a year. And to me, that's substantial. And the state DEP said they evaluated all the available data, but they didn't mention that the availability of that data was not very high. And in my mind, it was not sufficient. The other reason they chose the Martinsburg Airport, because they said, well, it's not far away, and the ground's pretty much the same. And they even said, it's reasonable to assume. Well, if you're working in science, you don't say it's reasonable to assume unless you filled a chalkboard with a bunch of equations and other facts, okay? Science is about not assuming. Science is based upon fact. And the EPA even says that proximity does not necessarily mean correlation. If you look at a cross-section between Martinsburg and the plant site, one, you'll see that the site is a bit higher. Oh, and so Rockwool couldn't quite agree with itself on what the elevation of the Martinsburg site was. It changes from page to page, paragraph to paragraph, all right? But if you look between the sites, you have the Peckham Creek that goes through there, and there's a tremendous drops and rises and jaggedness, is that a word, of the terrain between those two. Wind is like a fluid. If you poured it down a water slide, it's just going to go smoothly. But if you pour it down something where, like they do at road projects, where they put some rocks across the thing to slow it, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see turbulence, all right? And speaking of turbulence, that was another thing that they had to do. They came up with a friction coefficient, because friction will affect what happens to the air. Well, they did the comparison for Martinsburg, and and they did the comparison for the plant site. And the differences between these two range from an order of magnitude greater to five times greater. Martinsburg would be like 0.1. At the Ranson site, it would be 0.5. So it's a huge difference when they compared it. And they said, well, we'll be conservative. We'll just use the Martinsburg data. So basically what they did was they modeled the data at Martinsburg and called it Ranson. You can't do that. Other comparisons they did a correlation between the land use, okay? What I spoke about just a minute ago was land type, land use. They did a correlation between Garrett Park, Maryland, the Berkeley County sensor up by Martinsburg, and the site. And they found that the correlation between Garrett County and the factory site was 0.7, which is fairly high, but you know, you're still off by 0.3. Well, guess what? The correlation between Martinsburg and Ranson was 30%. 10 miles away, and the land use type was only 30%. On this graph, they list all the different types of things: schools, neighborhoods, land use, orchards. They do not even show an orchard being present at the Jefferson orchard site. Well, they said Clarksburg, but then they put the number for the station in Martinsburg. Okay, so the words are wrong, the number's right.
Right.
Okay. Washington County, Pennsylvania is over by Pittsburgh. The site associated with the number that they placed next to Washington County is in Pittopac Park, Philadelphia. So Rockwool proposed the sites, and you saw my analysis,
Right.
that those were bad sites.
Right.
Well, the sites that West Virginia said they used don't even freaking exist. They looked at that, so it looks good to submit, and the DEP looked at that and said, well, it makes sense to us. There's not even showing that there's actually an orchard present at the orchard site. And the EPA says, well, and this data comes, it's 92 or 96. And it's been updated since, but the EPA still says use the data from the 90s. And the EPA also says there's lots of other things out there. Look at all the information we have now. We have Google Earth, we have all this GIS information. You're not limited to simply using that, but they limited themselves to simply using that. To the layman, I think in plain terms, everybody's heard the term garbage in, garbage out. So basically what I'm saying, that you have garbage going into the model, so you can't expect anything but garbage coming out of the model. All right? So if the model is saying, oh yeah, everything's going to be dispersed fine over time, but you know that the information that went into that model is nonsensical or non-existent, all right, then there's no reason at all to trust whatever the results that come out. There are many switches and settings that you can put in to the models, all right? For instance, one of the settings was snow cover. Rockwool said that we are snow covered here throughout the winter season. It's been a long time since we've had a white Christmas, okay? On average, it's about 10% to 20% of the time that we even have snow on the ground. So that's incorrect, okay? So that affects the sunlight coming in and reflecting off, okay? That part of the models, okay? So there's so many wrong things that were going into the model. You can't trust whatever is coming out. The second part is when we talk about dispersion, you're going to say, well, okay, as I mentioned before, things go up and the wind takes it away. All right? About 30% of the time here, we don't have the wind to take that away. But that's not taking account into the models. One of the models, if the wind data for a particular day is calm, more than 75% of the day, they can't use that day in the modeling because it would be over conservative. It would show that there is no dispersion, okay? So one of the models they use, you can't use days when the winds are too calm. Which brings up another point. I spoke about the windroses that were developed for these other sites. The windrows that Rockwool submitted for the Martinsburg Airport shows that the winds are calm here only 1.72% of the time, which equates to about 180 hours per year. Less than a half hour a day that the winds are calm in our area. And that is just flat out wrong, okay? And I think what they did, they used the output from one of the models where you can't use the calm wind days to come up with that. So anybody, if you're a DEP, if you simply looked at that wind model, say, oh wow, the wind blows there, you know what, 97, 98% of the time. They shouldn't have any trouble with dispersion, okay? That data is just flat out wrong. Like Bob Dylan said, if something's not right, it's wrong. So in this case, if it is wrong, that those pollutants are not going to go anywhere. And over 30% of the time, we are just trapped in the valley underneath an inversion, and the air and whatever's in the air is not going to go anywhere. In a case like that, local effects take over. And by that I mean, air is like water, it tends to run downhill to the lower spot. So Rockwool sits slightly above North Jefferson Elementary School in the Fox Glen residential area. So if there is no real, what we call a gradient wind, where the air is moving from, say, like west to east or south to north due to a weather system, it's just simply going to drain down into those areas. If you will, it'd be like if you were out with a water hose and you were watering your flowers and you're pointing like this, you're going to disperse the water over this area and water your flowers. But if you just simply stand there and shoot the water straight up, it's going to go up, it's going to come down, and you're going to be all wet. Well, a temperature inversion, when we say the word inversion, is kind of reverse of what it should be. Okay? Normally, in the atmosphere, the temperature cools with height. If you imagine my arm as a temperature curve, and this is the surface, as you go up, the temperature curves. That's why when it gets hot and muggy, people like to go up to the mountains. It's cooler up there. It's cooler about 5 degrees per 1,000 feet that you go up. Okay? But under an inversion, what happens is the colder air is trapped here and the air actually warms as you go up. Now, we're all familiar with hot air balloons, right? And a hot air balloon goes up because the air within the balloon is warmer than the air around it, and there's a sufficient enough volume of that warm air that is buoyant. So it will go up as long as it's warmer than the air that's around it. So the pilot of the balloon, he pulls on the gas and burns some more gas and warms it, and up it goes. When he reaches the level he wants, he stops that, and he reaches a point of equilibrium, okay? So in the atmosphere, what happens if you have, if your air expands, it cools. If you compress it, it warms. It's like if you have a bicycle pump and you're pumping air into your tire. If you feel the nozzle where it goes in the tire, it's warm because you're compressing that air. You let the air out of the tire, it'll be cool because that air is expanding, okay? So what happens during the day, the sun heats the earth, the warm air starts going up, it mixes with the gradient winds before, and you have dispersion, okay? And that air expands as it goes up and cools. But at night, what happens, the earth quits getting heated, that air stops going up, it decouples from that upper atmosphere. And so now that air that's been lifted all day descends, and it descends, it compresses, just like the bicycle pump, and it warms. So the surface is cooling, that heat's going off to space, but the air above it is descending and warming, okay? So that's one cause of our inversions here. You have a nice clear night, the ground cools off, and everything below it is trapped. Another thing that happens here, and as mentioned before about scouring out the air, we're like a bathtub. You fill it up with cold water, right? And then you have, say, a warm front coming, where warmer air is coming. What happens is lighter, and it rides up over that dome. And eventually, because it's rubbing against that cold air and it's transporting its heat towards it, eventually that air will warm, or the winds will descend enough to scour it out. But in the meantime, we have an overrunning situation here, right, which happens a lot here, especially in the wintertime. And those contaminants continue to be trapped down in there. You're not going to see that occurring to any extent in Mississippi or Ontario. Well, the term sacrifice zones has been kind of used a lot when describing environmental justice. And it happens a lot where you have poor neighborhoods and you have companies coming in that are going to be doing things that are toxic. The term, I read this book, and they did many case studies of places. One was in Marietta, Ohio, just on the western border. Another one down in southern Florida where they made charcoal, right? So what happens is the companies kind of look for places that are in poor states, poor neighborhoods, poorly represented, okay? And they move in there because they know the people maybe do not have the knowledge of what's going on and what's coming out through the smokestacks, and they don't have the political power or the economic power to fight it, all right? And so it ends up, they're called sacrifice zones. Those areas have pretty much been sacrificed to industry. And the people there are just pretty much victims. If you looked at it like an ecological system, they're at the very bottom of the food chain. And I can see that trying to happen here. They picked one of the poorest states in the country, and they picked one of the poorer locations in our county. But they forgot that we are not one of the poor counties of the state. And we are fighting. If it turned out that the air permit was invalid, and by that meaning DEP would have to say, we messed up and we were withdrawing this permit, then Rockwool will no longer have a permit to construct, because that's what that permit says, permit to construct, all right? So if you don't have a permit to construct, I would think that you could not construct. But for that to occur, DEP would have to admit that what Rockwool submitted them was incorrect, whatever term you want to use, and that they erred seriously in their evaluation of it. Okay, so that's what would have to happen. It's not just an air permit that allows you to put stuff out. It is the permit to construct.
And what would keep them from doing that? I mean, do you think there's political pressure on the DEP? Is it more people are worried about their jobs? I mean, if it, looking at the evidence, why wouldn't they just say, hey, we screwed up?
Well, looking at the evidence, I don't know that they actually have looked at the evidence, other than, well, they looked at the permit, which is the evidence I'm using, right? And they said it's okay, right? It's hard for me to say what logic or motivation is going through another person's mind, right? But we have heard them say at another hearing that they basically have to grant the permits. If the people or the submitters go through the steps, they pretty much have to go through and grant the permit. And DEP has a history of allowing things that happen that the normal person might say, well, no, I don't think you're protecting the environment there, okay? So what their motivation is or what their logic is, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between incompetence and cunning. And this is one of those cases where I find it very difficult to do that.